Welcome to the History AI podcast, where the past comes alive with facts, anecdotes, and a dash of humor. Here are your hosts, Chuck and Marco.
Welcome back to the History AI podcast, where we break down the past with storytelling, analysis, and when appropriate, a bit of humor. I'm Chuck.
And I'm Marco. Before we dive in, we'd like to mention that today's episode is being released on Veterans Day, a day of remembrance and gratitude for those who served in the military. Around the world, it's known by different names. In the UK and Commonwealth countries, it's Remembrance Day, and in France and Belgium, it's Armistice Day.
It's a day that marks the end of World War I, making it especially fitting for our topic, the Treaty of Versailles, the document that attempted to build peace after the war's devastating end.
Let's set the scene. It's 1919. Europe is in ruins, exhausted from 4 years of conflict. The armistice on November 11, 1918, stopped the fighting, but now it was time to figure out how to piece the world back together.
Let's talk about the main architects of this peace. The Big Four led the negotiations.
First, President Woodrow Wilson of the United States. He came with his 14 points, emphasizing self-determination and lasting peace. Wilson was the idealist in the room.
Then we have David Lloyd George, Prime Minister of the UK. He wanted a balanced approach, peace, but with some level of punishment to satisfy British public sentiment.
And the heavy hitter, Georges Clemenceau of France, nicknamed the Tiger. He wanted Germany to pay, literally and metaphorically. His goal was to make sure France would never face a German threat again.
Finally, Vittorio Orlando from Italy, who felt sidelined and walked out when things didn't go Italy's way.
Now, let's break down the details of the Treaty of Versailles. This was more than just a list of penalties, it was a blueprint for Europe's immediate future and, as it turned out, its eventual chaos.
The treaty's most notorious section was Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. This single article declared that Germany and its allies were solely responsible for causing World War I. This wasn't just a symbolic statement, it was the legal justification for demanding reparations from Germany.
And those reparations were staggering. While the total amount fluctuated and was revised over time, the initial figure set in 1921 was 132 billion gold marks, equivalent to hundreds of billions in today's dollars. These payments placed an immense strain on Germany's already devastated economy, leading to hyperinflation in the early 1920s. People would carry wheelbarrows full of cash to buy basic necessities like bread. The social and economic repercussions were catastrophic.
But reparations weren't the only part of the treaty that crippled Germany. The territorial losses were sweeping. Germany had to cede Alsace-Lorraine back to France, which it had seized during the Franco-Prussian War of 1871. This region was rich in resources and symbolic of national pride for both countries.
And that was just the start. The Saar Basin, a key industrial area, was placed under the administration of the League of Nations, with its coal mines handed over to France for 15 years. After that period, a plebiscite would decide its fate, but in the meantime, Germany lost significant income and resources.
Not to mention the new Polish corridor. This was carved out to give the newly re-established Poland access to the Baltic Sea, effectively splitting East Prussia from the rest of Germany. The loss of this land severed economic and cultural ties, and the city of Danzig, modern-day Gdansk, was declared a free city under the League of Nations control.
Plus, there were significant implications for Germany's colonial empire. All overseas colonies were taken and distributed as League of Nations mandates to Britain, France, Japan, and other allied powers. This loss was more than just a hit to German prestige, it stripped the nation of potential economic support from its colonies.
Then there was the military aspect. Germany was required to drastically reduce its army to 100,000 men and was forbidden from having an air force, tanks, or submarines. The Navy was allowed only a handful of ships and was banned from constructing any large warships. The Rhineland, a crucial buffer zone along the French border, was to be demilitarized. German troops weren't even allowed near it.
To put it in perspective, this wasn't just limiting Germany's military, it was essentially disarming the country to prevent any chance of remilitarization. For a nation steeped in military tradition and identity, this was humiliating.
Beyond the clauses that directly affected Germany, the treaty reshaped Europe in other ways. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had already collapsed, and new nations like Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia emerged from its remnants. But the borders were drawn with little regard for ethnic or cultural coherence, setting up conflicts for the future.
All of these elements, territorial losses, economic burdens, military restrictions, combined to create a document that many historians argue was not just a peace treaty, but a ticking time bomb. For Germany, it was more than a setback, it was a national wound that festered over the next 2 decades.
It's no surprise then, that this document, signed in the opulent Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, sowed seeds of resentment. German leaders signed under duress, knowing full well the blowback they'd face at home. The term Diktat quickly entered German vocabulary, a dictated peace that they had no say in crafting.
The Treaty of Versailles may have been an attempt to ensure peace, but its harsh measures, economic burdens, and deep-seated humiliation set the stage for the rise of extremism and, ultimately, World War II.
Now, let's dig into the reactions to the Treaty of Versailles and its long-term fallout. It's hard to overstate how divisive this treaty was, both at the time and in hindsight. In the immediate aftermath of its signing on June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, there was a range of emotions from the world's major powers.
Let's start with Germany, where the reaction was one of shock and outrage. Many Germans felt they'd been misled by their own government into believing that the armistice would lead to a negotiated, fair peace. Instead, what they got was the Diktat, a dictated peace that they had no hand in shaping. The signing of the treaty was viewed as an act of betrayal, and the government officials who agreed to it were branded as November criminals.
That phrase, November criminals, encapsulates a deep resentment that only grew over time. This perceived betrayal fueled a narrative that Germany hadn't really lost the war on the battlefield but had been stabbed in the back by politicians and certain minority groups. This myth would be leveraged with dangerous effectiveness by extremists, most notably Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party.
The psychological impact on Germany was profound. The loss of territory and the war guilt clause were more than just diplomatic setbacks, they were personal humiliations that cut to the heart of German identity. Germans were no longer citizens of a proud empire but of a diminished state weighed down by guilt and poverty. The hyperinflation of the early 1920s only exacerbated this feeling, as the economy spiraled out of control. It got so bad that at one point, people would use currency as wallpaper because it was cheaper than buying actual wallpaper.
The treaty didn't just cause turmoil in Germany though. It sparked controversy among the Allied powers as well. In the United States, President Woodrow Wilson's vision for a League of Nations was integral to his idea of a sustainable peace. However, his idealism clashed with political realities back home. The U.S. Senate, wary of entanglements in European affairs, refused to ratify the treaty. So, while the League of Nations was formed, the United States never joined, weakening the organization from the start.
This refusal marked a significant shift in U.S. foreign policy, steering the country toward isolationism. The absence of the U.S. from the League of Nations rendered the body less influential and unable to effectively mediate future international conflicts. It was a case of a great idea undermined by lackluster execution and political short-sightedness.
France, on the other hand, was somewhat satisfied but still uneasy. Clemenceau, the Tiger, had succeeded in securing strict measures to keep Germany at bay, but even he recognized that enforcing these terms would be difficult. France's eastern border felt more secure with the demilitarization of the Rhineland, but the French leadership knew that true safety would come only if Germany remained weakened for the foreseeable future.
Meanwhile, the British response was mixed. Lloyd George managed to strike a balance between public and political pressures by punishing Germany enough to appease voters, but not so much that it would cripple future trade. He famously remarked that they needed to squeeze Germany until the pips squeak, but he also feared that too harsh a treatment could lead to future instability. And spoiler alert, it did.
Italy, represented by Vittorio Orlando, felt outright betrayed by the treaty's outcome. Italy had joined the war on the promise of territorial gains that were ultimately not honored, leading to widespread disillusionment. This dissatisfaction sowed seeds of domestic unrest and laid the groundwork for the rise of Benito Mussolini and the Fascist Party.
Beyond Europe, the Treaty of Versailles sent ripples through other parts of the world. In Japan, there was frustration over the limited gains it received despite being on the winning side. This dissatisfaction contributed to a growing sense of alienation from Western powers and fueled Japan's shift toward militarism in the following decades.
And in the Middle East, the mandates carved out of the Ottoman Empire didn't align with Wilson's promises of self-determination. Instead, they reflected the colonial ambitions of Britain and France. These decisions planted the seeds for long-term instability in the region, with tensions that resonate even today.
The Treaty of Versailles was less a peace agreement and more a fragile armistice on paper. It promised stability but delivered resentment, economic pain, and a fractured international landscape. The treaty may have ended World War I, but it set the stage for an even more devastating conflict just 2 decades later.
The reactions to the treaty were a mix of triumph and trepidation, hope and bitterness. The Allied leaders knew they'd changed the world, but few could have predicted just how explosive that change would be. Now, let's dive into the long-term impact of the Treaty of Versailles, because this treaty didn't just end World War I, it set the stage for the most catastrophic conflict the world had ever seen, World War II.
The treaty's harsh terms had immediate and profound consequences for Germany. Economically, the reparations burden placed Germany in a dire financial situation. Hyperinflation in the early 1920s reached levels so extreme that workers were paid twice a day just to keep up with prices that were doubling by the hour. Stories from the period tell of people using cash to light fires or make crafts because it was cheaper than buying paper goods. This economic collapse eroded the middle class and created widespread poverty, planting seeds of anger and desperation.
This atmosphere of instability was fertile ground for radical ideas. The stab-in-the-back myth, that Germany hadn't been defeated on the battlefield but betrayed by politicians and certain ethnic groups, gained traction. This narrative was perpetuated by nationalists and socialists who sought someone to blame for Germany's humiliation. Enter Adolf Hitler.
Hitler and the Nazi Party skillfully exploited the resentment left in the wake of the Treaty of Versailles. The war guilt clause and the reparations were powerful rallying points in his rhetoric. He promised to overturn the treaty, rebuild Germany's military, and restore its rightful place as a major power. By 1933, the Nazi Party had risen to power, fueled by the anger and humiliation that the treaty had sown.
And it wasn't just Germany that felt the tremors. The weakness of the treaty's enforcement mechanisms became painfully apparent throughout the 1930s. The League of Nations, which was meant to enforce peace and prevent future conflicts, proved ineffective. Without the United States membership and with limited authority, it couldn't prevent aggression by nations like Japan, which invaded Manchuria in 1931, or Italy's conquest of Ethiopia in 1935.
When Hitler began to break the terms of the treaty, rearming Germany and remilitarizing the Rhineland in 1936, the League's response was tepid at best. France and Britain, both weary from the economic fallout of the Great Depression and haunted by the memories of World War I, chose a policy of appeasement. They hoped that by allowing some violations of the treaty, they could avoid another war. This strategy backfired spectacularly.
The territorial and political outcomes of the Treaty of Versailles also created fault lines that would ignite in World War II. The creation of the Polish corridor and the status of Danzig, for example, became a pretext for Germany's invasion of Poland in 1939. The seeds of conflict were baked into the treaty's provisions, whether intentionally or not.
But Germany wasn't the only nation with grievances. Italy, feeling slighted after not receiving the territorial gains it had expected, turned to Mussolini's fascist party, which promised to restore Italian pride and build an empire. This dissatisfaction with the post-war settlement contributed to the Axis alliances that would later challenge global stability.
Then there's Japan. Although it was technically an Allied power and signed the Treaty of Versailles, Japan was frustrated by the lack of recognition and the limited territorial gains it received. Its proposals for racial equality were rejected, fostering a sense of alienation from the West. This discontent helped push Japan toward a path of militarism and imperial expansion in the following decades, culminating in the invasion of China and, eventually, the attack on Pearl Harbor.
The Middle East was another region where the treaty's legacy sparked long-term instability. The carving up of the Ottoman Empire into British and French mandates sowed resentment and laid the foundation for future conflicts. The promises of independence to Arab leaders were largely ignored, replaced by a new form of imperial oversight that fueled nationalist movements for decades.
The Treaty of Versailles also influenced the way future peace treaties were crafted. When World War II ended, the Allied leaders, aware of the mistakes of Versailles, took a different approach. This time, they prioritized rebuilding defeated nations rather than punishing them, leading to initiatives like the Marshall Plan that helped revive Europe's economy and foster cooperation rather than division.
The Treaty of Versailles was a complex document that sought to end one conflict but unintentionally laid the groundwork for another. It showed how the balance between justice and revenge can be perilous, and how a punishing peace can sometimes be more destabilizing than war itself.
The treaty's legacy is a sobering lesson in the dangers of peace treaties that emphasize punishment over reconciliation. It's a reminder that true peace requires not just the cessation of conflict but a commitment to rebuilding and addressing underlying grievances.
The Treaty of Versailles may have marked the official end of World War I, but its shadow loomed long over the 20th century, reminding us of how fragile peace can be when it's built on a foundation of resentment and retribution. We hope you enjoyed this look at the Treaty of Versailles. It's a lesson in how even the best intentions can have unintended consequences.
If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to rate us 5 stars, subscribe, and share the podcast with history buffs in your life. Your support helps us grow.
And keep those suggestions coming for future episodes. Reach out to us on social media and check out our merch in the show notes.
Our episodes stay evergreen, so share the story of the Treaty of Versailles with your friends and family. Until next time, this was the History AI Podcast.
Stay curious, folks.
Discover the dark, enchanting world of shadowed journeys, the tales of Jordan and Squishy. Follow Jordan, a seemingly innocent girl with a hidden power, and her loyal companion Squishy, who reincarnates into different animals after each battle. Venture into the ominous depths of the Whispering Woods as they face fierce creatures and uncover ancient secrets. Will Jordan succumb to the darkness within, or will she find the strength to forge a new destiny? Perfect for fans of dark fantasy and epic quests, this spellbinding tale will captivate and leave you pondering the fine line between hero and villain. Dive into Shadowed Journeys today. Available on Amazon now.